There is a photo that keeps circulating in tennis circles this July, and if you have not seen it yet, you are about to understand why it matters so much. Because in it stands a 21-year-old from the Philippines, racket in hand, back on the same clay courts where her whole story started, and standing near her is a man whose name is stitched into the walls of the very academy she trains at, Rafael Nadal. The 22-time Grand Slam champion, the king of clay, a man who does not hand out his attention for free, and yet here he is, once again drawn toward one particular player, and the question everyone in the sport is asking right now is simple: why her, why now, and what exactly is being fixed before the biggest tournament of the year? So stick around, because this story has layers most people are missing. And by the end you will understand exactly what is at stake for Alex Eala as she races the clock toward the US Open. And honestly, the more you dig into this story, the more it feels like one of those rare setups in sport where the timing, the personalities, and the history all line up almost too neatly, the kind of arc you could not script if you tried. Let us rewind for a second, because to understand why this moment carries so much weight, you need to understand where it all began, and it did not begin on a grand stage. It began in a country with almost no tennis infrastructure to speak of, no long tradition of producing tour-level players, nothing that would make anyone bet on a kid from the Philippines becoming a fixture in the world's top 30. Alex Eala was just a girl with a racket and a grandfather who coached her from the time she could barely hold the frame steady, hitting balls day after day with her brother by her side, building a foundation nobody outside her family really noticed. Then came the win in France that put her on the radar, and not long after, an offer arrived that would change everything: a scholarship to train at the academy Rafael Nadal had built in his hometown on the island of Majorca. She's 13 years old, and she packed her life into suitcases and left for Spain, her brother traveling with her parents staying behind in the Philippines, trusting a decision that must have felt equal parts thrilling and terrifying. That is not a small thing to ask of a family, uprooting a child from everything familiar and sending her across the world, chasing a dream that had no real precedent back home. But she stayed, and she trained, and the years on those clay courts in Manicure shaped her into something more than just a promised junior. She learned the demanding daily rhythm the academy is famous for, the idea that greatness is built quietly, in the repetitions nobody applauds, long before any crowd ever sees the result. Early mornings on court, hours in the gym, film sessions breaking down footwork and shot selection, all of it stacked on top of the ordinary business of just being a teenager living far from her parents. She has talked openly in interviews about how strange it still feels, meeting Nadal in those hallways as a kid, how she gets tongue-tied around him even now, how the nerves apparently never go away no matter how many trophies pile up. That kind of admission tells you something important, that for all her poise on a match court, this is still a young woman who grew up inside the mythology of the place she trains at, who watched the man whose name is on the building become a legend in real time while she was still learning to hold her serve toss steady. By the time she walked across the stage to collect her academy diploma in 2026, tennis had already started paying attention, and in a twist nobody could have scripted better, it was IGA Swiatek invited personally by Nadal who handed Eala the diploma. Two players, one just beginning her rise and one already a five-time major champion, sharing a stage that would later mean far more than anyone realized in that moment. Fast forward to 2026 and Eala walked into the Miami Open as a wild card ranked outside the top 100, and by the time she left, she had beaten a former Grand Slam champion, taken down the reigning Australian Open winner, and then in the quarterfinals, faced Swiatek herself, the very player who had handed her that diploma 2 years earlier. Eala beat her in straight sets. It was the kind of story that writes itself, the student outgrowing the moment, the academy's newest headline act stepping fully into the light, and Nadal, watching from a distance the way he tends to do with his academy's rising talents, sent his congratulations publicly, a small gesture that spoke volumes about how closely he tracks what happens on those courts even after his own playing days had wound down. That Miami run alone would have been enough to define a career, an unranked wild card fighting through 5 matches against former champions and top 10 regulars, but Eala treated it like a starting point rather than a peak, and the following year she kept adding to the resume, grinding through the clay swing, working with Tony Nadal himself during her preparation, and slowly climbing the rankings one tournament at a time, even through stretches where results did not always go her way. Now bring yourself up to this summer, because this is where the story gets genuinely fascinating. Eala arrived at Wimbledon seeded for the very first time in her Grand Slam career, and what followed was the deepest run of her life, a run that included a win over the defending champion Swiatek again, this time in the third round, a result so poetic that even the broadcasters could not stop mentioning the diploma ceremony from years earlier. She pushed all the way to the 4th round, further than any Filipino man or woman had ever gone at a major, and for a nation of over 100 million people, many of whom had never had a reason to care about tennis before, this was appointment viewing. Streets quieted, timelines flooded, and a new national obsession was born almost overnight. The kind of moment where taxi drivers and office workers who had never watched a tennis match in their lives suddenly knew exactly what a breakpoint was. She had already built momentum heading into the grass season 2, capturing her first ever WDA title on grass at Birmingham just weeks before Wimbledon even started. So this was not some isolated flash, it was the culmination of a genuinely excellent stretch of tennis. But then came the loss to Jasmine Paolini, a tight 3-set battle that ended Eala's run, and in its aftermath something interesting happened, not criticism exactly, but a very pointed, very specific diagnosis from one of the greatest players to ever hold a racket. Martina Navratilova, working as a broadcast analyst throughout the tournament, was blunt about where Eala's game still had a gap, focusing squarely on the serve, describing it as soft, easily handled by an opponent willing to step in and attack the second delivery. She pointed out that Eala's first serve was landing in a modest range even though her frame and her athleticism suggested she had far more power available if she chose to use it, and she zeroed in on something that felt almost counterintuitive for a broadcaster to flag that Eala, one of the tour's rare left-handers, was not consistently exploiting the natural angles that lefty serves create against right-handed opponents, often directing the ball into an opponent's stronger side rather than slicing it away into open space. It was not a takedown, it was closer to a scouting report delivered live on air, the kind of critique that only lands because the person delivering it clearly believes there is real talent underneath the flaw, and Navratilova was not alone in flagging it either. Other analysts covering the tournament pointed to the same statistical pattern, noting that Eala was barely varying her serve placement, sending a disproportionate number of deliveries down similar lines instead of mixing locations the way top servers do to keep returners guessing. For a player with her physical tools, that predictability is the kind of thing that eventually gets punished by anyone patient enough to sit back and read it, and Paolini, a crafty veteran with excellent return instincts, did exactly that. And that is where this story intersects with Nadal again, because if there is one player alive who understands the specific power of a lefty serve, it is him. His entire career was built partly on that exact weapon, the way his left-handed spin dragged opponents off the court, the way his serve opened up angles that right-handers simply could not replicate. He built a technique around it, refined it over 2 decades at the highest level, and he still oversees the coaching philosophy at the academy that carries his name. So when word started spreading that Eala was back in Mallorca this month, working with the coaching staff, spending time on the practice courts once again with people connected to Nadal's inner circle, it did not take long for tennis fans and pundits to connect the dots. And the buzz around this training block has been loud, with plenty of voices online speculating that the serve overhaul everyone has been calling for might finally be underway, guided by the very academy, and possibly the very champion, whose game solved this exact puzzle decades ago. It helps that this is not the first time Nadal has taken a direct interest in Eala's development. The two have crossed paths at the academy for years, and Eala herself has spoken about how surreal it still feels whenever they interact, admitting in interviews that even now, after all her success, she gets nervous and tongue-tied around him, joking that it apparently never stops feeling that way no matter how many times they meet. Ahead of this season, the pair had a hands-on practice session together during the off-season, something Eala later described as a moment she will never forget, and Nadal has been openly supportive of her rise, publicly praising her biggest wins as they happened. None of that guarantees a formal headline-grabbing intervention this time around, and nobody close to the academy has put out some grand official statement about it, but the pattern speaks for itself. A champion who built his legend on lefty power watching a rising lefty star get picked apart on exactly that front, at exactly the moment she has the ranking, the confidence, and the platform to actually fix it. And the timing genuinely could not be better. Eala has a short, dense stretch of hard-court tournaments standing between her and the US Open, starting with the Mubadala DC Open at the end of July, followed almost immediately by a trip to Toronto for the National Bank Open, one of the biggest non-major events on the calendar. Before she is expected to take part in the Stars of the Open exhibition in New York alongside a handful of the sport's most talked about young stars. Every one of those stops is essentially a live test of whatever adjustments come out of this training block. A chance to see in real matches whether the serve genuinely looks different, whether the placement has changed, whether the extra pace Navratilova insisted was sitting untapped in Eala's arm finally starts showing up on the radar gun. Every match in Washington and Toronto essentially becomes a data point for anyone watching closely, a chance to track first serve percentages, average speeds, and placement patterns against the version of Eala that showed up at Wimbledon just weeks earlier. Tennis fans online have already started treating this stretch like a kind of experiment, comparing clips from her practice sessions in Mallorca against her match footage from London, looking for the smallest tells, a different toss height, a slightly altered grip, anything that might hint at real change underneath the surface. Because here is the thing people sometimes miss when they talk about Eala's game. Her issue was never a lack of talent or tennis sense. Even her critics, Navratilova included, have gone out of their way to praise her court awareness, her footwork, her ability to problem-solve mid-match in a way that feels almost unusual for someone so young. She has been compared, fairly or not, to a certain never-say-die competitive streak that Nadal himself became famous for, an unwillingness to accept that a point, or a match, or a season is over just because things look difficult. What she has lacked, according to almost everyone who has broken down her recent losses, is a serve that matches the rest of her game, a shot that can function as a weapon rather than simply a way to start the point. Fix that, and suddenly her results against the very top of the tour, the players who can expose a soft delivery the way Paolini did at Wimbledon, start to look very different. That is the real stakes behind this quiet training block in Mallorca. This is not just about one tournament or one shot. It is about whether a player who has already beaten multiple Grand Slam champions, already climbed into the top 30 in the world, already become the biggest name in Philippine sports history, can close the one gap that keeps separating her from the tour's true elite. And if the rumors swirling around her time back at the Academy this month turn out to be accurate, if this really is a targeted effort with the coaching staff, and perhaps even some direct input from Nadal himself, to rebuild that serve from the grip up, then the version of Eala who shows up in New York for the US Open could look meaningfully different from the one Paolini beat at Wimbledon just a few weeks ago. Picture it for a second, a first career appearance in the main draw as a fully seeded player, a first round bye, a ranking high enough now that the draw itself should treat her with real respect, and a serve that, for the first time in her career, might actually match the rest of her weapons. That is not a guarantee of a title. Nobody